Often when we talk about the Stuarts in British history, and certainly in English history, we're talking about this lot here on the screen. But of course, the Stuarts were an ancient Scottish royal family. They'd been ruling Scotland since 1371, when Robert II was the first of the Stuarts to become King of Scotland. And he was actually the grandson of Robert the Bruce. And here's an interesting thing. The Stuarts are always sort of seen as this bit of the afterthought in England, the afterthought after the Tudors. But the funny thing is the Stuarts had been ruling Scotland for over 100 years before Henry VII had his victory at Bosworth Field. So, they had been around for a long time in Scotland. They'd obviously been a lot of supporters of previous kings, married into the royal family, and ultimately Robert II was their first king. Don't want to spend too long on the Scottish royal family of the Stuarts. Not because I'm English, although I am, although quarter Scottish, so I think I have a foot in both camps. The Stuarts really have an impact in England and in Ireland and Wales, and indeed in North America and in the rest of Europe, after they inherited the throne of England. So this is not dishing Scottish history, and actually I might come back and do some Scottish history, which I find fascinating actually. And the Stuarts, they're a barking bunch, but an early Scottish history is absolutely fantastic, as indeed is early Welsh history. Only the thing is, I really can't pronounce most of the Welsh names. So, the Stuarts, as I say, have been around since 1371, and as rulers of Scotland, they ultimately in 1603 became rulers of England as well. And how on earth did they achieve that? Well, it is with a Tudor link. The Stuarts ended up on the throne. James VI of Scotland, James I of England in 1603. Inherited the throne from Queen Elizabeth I. But how on earth did that happen? Well, let's just go upstream. So in the middle of the family tree there, you can see Elizabeth I in bold and her father, Henry VIII. And at the very top of the screen, we've got Henry VII, the first of the Tudor dynasty in England. Well, Henry VII had 3 children who lived to adulthood at any rate. Henry VIII, his younger sister, Mary, it gets very confusing with Mary Tudors, all right, and an older sister, Margaret. Mary we can discount, but for those of you who are interested in Tudor history, her granddaughter was Lady Jane Grey. So Lady Jane Grey, Queen for 9 days of England, did have royal blood. And that was part of the claim when people tried to put her on the throne of England. The older sister, Margaret, married James IV of Scotland. He was a Stuart. Interestingly, actually, James IV, his father was James III, and he married Margaret of Denmark, and actually married her in this week in British history. And as a dowry, Margaret of Denmark gave 2 Danish-owned islands to Scotland, Shetland and Orkney. So Shetland and Orkney had only recently in Scottish history come back into the fold, having been taken over by Viking raiders back in the late 800s. So James IV was their son, and he married Margaret Tudor. James IV died actually, and Margaret Tudor then married and had a second marriage. But we won't bother going down that family tree, okay? Their son was James V. James V died young, and he had a daughter, left a baby daughter, 1-year-old daughter, less than 1-year-old, actually Mary Queen of Scots. So Mary Queen of Scots, again, is a Stuart, and that's how she fits into the whole story with Elizabeth I. She had Tudor blood. And just on this one, when England, the Reformation had happened in England, Henry VIII had divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Roman Catholics believed she was his only wife. English history likes to talk about Henry VIII and his 6 wives. They basically said those were all illegitimate, those were illegal marriages, because the Pope had never nullified his first marriage. Therefore, both Edward VI and Elizabeth I were illegitimate children, according to Catholics. And therefore, after Mary, the only legitimate daughter from Catherine of Aragon, had died, whilst the English had put Queen Elizabeth I on the throne, she was not a legitimate heir. according to Roman Catholics, in England. And they looked to the next of kin. And they looked across to Margaret Tudor and down through James V to Mary Queen of Scots. And that's why they believed Mary Queen of Scots, who just happened to be Catholic, was the legitimate Queen of England as well as Scotland. Hope that puts a few things into perspective there. Mary Queen of Scots was driven from the throne. She married Lord Darnley. She a bit of a marriage made in hell. And he murdered her one of her aides, who he believed was having an affair with Mary Queen of Scots. He actually murdered her with a knife in front of the pregnant Mary Queen of Scots. So, funny enough, that marriage was going nowhere. And just shortly after baby James was born, Lord Darnley was assassinated, just blown up in Kirkerfields in Scotland, in Edinburgh. And many people pointed the finger at Mary Queen of Scots and the Earl of Bothwell, who suddenly became her lover. And consternation in Scotland, especially amongst the Calvinistic Scots, but many of the nobility as well, felt that she had gone way beyond the pale, and she was forced to abdicate. There was a rising, she was forced to abdicate, and she fled to England. And James was kept in Scotland and proclaimed King of Scotland. Mary Queen of Scots ultimately ended up being beheaded in England, and we can forget that part of the story for the time being. James remained on the throne of Scotland, and in 1603, he was, in March 1603, when Elizabeth died, he was proclaimed King of England. Now, James at this stage was 36 years old. He'd been a king for 35 years, and he thought he was a pretty good king. He knew his way around, and the murky world of Scottish politics at this time, he had sort of manoeuvred his way around it quite successfully, and felt that being a king was something he was pretty good at. What he didn't realise that England was a very different beast, and the English Parliament in particular was a very different beast to the Scottish Parliament, and was flexing its muscles with kings, and had been for quite several generations. That would come back to haunt both James and his son. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, and it's very important to realise that for most of the time that the Stuarts were on the throne of England, they were kings or queens of Scotland in their own rights. And this was not a political union between England and Scotland. This happened to be a union between the person wearing two crowns. Okay, so Scotland carried on in its own fashion. James actually promised that he would come back to Scotland on a regular basis. Immediately got down south and realised that there were lots more goodies down in London than he could find in Edinburgh. Strangely enough, he never appeared in Scotland, and he appeared, I think, once again in Scotland after he'd become King of England. But he was crowned in July 1603, crowned King James I of England, and also King James I of Ireland as well, which was a separate crown as well at that time. So almost from the word go, he was beset by plots. There was a plot to try and replace him with his cousin, Lady Arabella Stuart, and that plot was actually led by Sir Walter Raleigh. Yes, Sir Walter Raleigh of Virginia fame. He led that, and he ended up in prison in the Tower of London, actually. Lady Arabella also ended up in the Tower of London, but not for that plot. She was to marry without the king's, in the royal family. If you're in the line of succession, which obviously Lady Arabella is there, you need the head of the family's permission to marry. Principally because they don't want you marrying someone who you create almost like a new power block. And strangely enough, Lady Arabella Stuart did exactly that. She married, in fact, he's on here. Can you see over on the right-hand side, Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp? Well, if you look, he's also got Tudor blood in him. And she went off and married him without asking James. And basically, he put both of them in the Tower because that was a potentially, you look where they are in that family tree. That is a potential rival power block that was being created. Obviously, the most famous plot against him wasn't the plot with, which is called the main plot with Lady Arabella Stuart and Walter Raleigh, but of course, the gunpowder plot of 1605. Managed to survive that, obviously. Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators were all hung, drawn and quartered. Well, in Guy Fawkes' case, he was hung and his neck broke in the hanging part of the hang, drawing and quartering. so he didn't need to. He was spared the grisly rest of that torture, and James effectively after that was secure on his throne. The problem that James had in England was that he believed in the divine right of kings to rule. In fact, he'd written 2 papers on it, and he described Parliament as being the King's High Court, which was not the way the English Parliament believed that their relationship with the monarch had been, certainly through Tudor times. And many of them would believe further back than that as well, or certainly would argue it when they felt it right. Parliament were flexing their muscles, and James found a way around that. He regularly dissolved Parliament, the English Parliament we're talking about here, and ruled through. He raised money through monopolies he had, through levies. He was able to levy certain taxes. He sold peerages, and that money came into his coffers, and all that meant he didn't need a parliament to raise taxes for him. He also tried to get his younger son, Charles, to marry the Infanta of Spain, the daughter of the King of Spain, probably the superpower of the time, and obviously incredibly wealthy, thanks to all the gold they were shipping over from South and Central America, from their empire there, having conquered the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas. And obviously James, canny that he was, realised that if he got his younger son married off to the Infanta, he'd get a lovely big dowry, and that would mean that he could spend that on whatever he fancied, and again, didn't need Parliament to come and raise taxes for him. It's great, isn't it? In 1621, his daughter, I'll show the daughters in a minute, but he had a daughter, she married the Prince of the Palatine in Germany, a Protestant state that was occupied by Spain. And eventually he decided, despite having tried to marry his younger son off to Spain, that he would go to the aid of his daughter and raise an army to take back her country for her German principality, or her husband's principality. He called Parliament, and he thought Parliament would be up for this. A war with Spain is always good in England at this time. However, Parliament refused to give him any money, unless he only used the money for a war, that they introduced further anti-Roman Catholic laws, that they had a full-on war with Spain, and not a small expedition to Germany, a full-on war out down there in the Bay of Biscay and that. Let's get some fleets going to Cadiz and let's attack the Spanish treasure ships as they're all coming back from South America. And finally, by the way, Charles was not to marry a Roman Catholic, he was to marry a Protestant. James was infuriated, and he basically he dissolved Parliament straight away. And throughout his reign, really, he had this running battle with Parliament. He just tried to avoid them, and that led to an ambassador, actually the French ambassador, calling him the wisest fool in Christendom, because what could he have done if he worked with Parliament rather than against them? And yet he's known as this sort of wisest fool in Christendom, and yet he had some legacies that he left, which run to this very day. And I thought I'd just share some of those with you. First and foremost, in 1610, he pressurised the London guilds to support him as he put settled Protestants into Ireland. Ireland, Catholic country, and he decided that a great idea would be to settle some loyal Protestants there. He brought Protestants from Scotland, from his native Scotland, but also some from England. And in particular, he pressurised the London guilds to settle people in the city of Derry, or the town of Derry, which they renamed, because they were the London guilds, Londonderry. And that Protestant settlement, the Protestant colonisation of the northern part of Ireland, still plays out to this very day in a very modern way. But that is the Protestant majority that there is in Northern Ireland at the moment. He also, of course, established and sponsored settlements in North America. Walter Raleigh had tried, so Walter Raleigh had attempted it, he'd failed. But in 1607, John Smith landed at, strange enough, Jamestown in Virginia, and that was the first permanent settlement in North America from the British. Obviously, it was English, but with the Scottish king, or an English king as well, I suppose the English will call him. It was pretty touch and go as to whether this new settlement would go the same way as Walter Raleigh's settlements. Certainly in 1609, 1610, they had a time called the Starving Time, where at the end of it, only 60 of the 500 settlers were left. The rest had perished. They were somewhat rescued, or the colony was rescued, this fledgling colony was rescued by the introduction of tobacco by a man called John Rolfe, the same John Rolfe who went on to marry Pocahontas. He brought Pocahontas to King James's court. King James met Pocahontas. She died in, I think it was Gravesend in Kent shortly afterwards. But that was the beginning of the tobacco plantation culture of Virginia. And it was supported initially. They realised it was a very labour-intensive market. It was initially supported by convicts. Long before England had started sending convicts to Australia, we actually sent them to North America, and in particular to Virginia. It's believed that over 50,000 convicts were sent to North America prior to the War of Independence. And alongside them were a whole group of indentured servants. These are servants who basically, it was a sort of a, I call it slavery in inverted commas. It basically, you worked for someone for a set period. And those obviously didn't work. They didn't have enough labour from convicts or indentured. And that is why ultimately they found an even cheaper source of and plentiful source of labour, black Africans. Of course, further north from Virginia in 1620, we had the Pilgrim Fathers landing as well in New England, in Massachusetts. Elsewhere, Bermuda was settled during King James's time, and it remains a British overseas territory to this day. And indeed, at the time, Barbados was settled and colonised by the Britain. It was, so England's first colonies in North America really happened in King James's time. Finally, King James's other contribution, legacy to the world was the King James Bible, commissioned in 1604, just after he became King of England, published in 1611. And scholars reckon it has more phrases than any other single book. It was added more phrases than any other single book to the English language. Some of them include, and here are just some of the ones, mainly that my dad used to come out with most of these ones actually. Let there be light, King James Bible. There's a fly in the ointment. My brother's keeper. I seem to remember Tony Blair mentioned that in a political speech. A law unto themselves. That sounds like politicians nowadays, doesn't it? A bottomless pit. Probably about politicians nowadays as well. And finally, my favourite, eat, drink and be merry. All from the King James Bible, which became sort of almost like the standard Bible for the Anglican and churches going around the world from King James's time. James I died, James I of England, James VI of Scotland, died in 1625. And he was succeeded by his son, Charles. Conveniently, for all of us who have to do the James I of England, James VI of Scotland, he was Charles I of both Scotland and England. So that was a lucky one. He wasn't supposed to have been king. Charles was the spare. He had an older brother called Henry, a nod to the Henrys, Henry Tudor, Henry VII, and indeed probably Henry VIII. But Henry had died in 1612, the older brother. Very popular, very talented, but he died in 1612. And Charles suddenly was thrown into into the line of succession as the heir apparent. He'd been born in 1600. He was born in 1600 in Dunfermline Castle in Scotland. He was quite sickly as a child with rickets. It took him till he was about 2.5 before he could walk. And he was well over a year after James had come down to England, to London, before they felt Charles was able enough, well enough to travel down to join his father. As I said, he had originally, James had planned that he would marry the Infanta of Spain. That all fell apart. And instead, actually, when Charles came to the throne in 1625, he was still a bachelor boy and a bit of a catch, King of England, Ireland and Scotland, plus a few little territories in North America. And who would marry him? Obviously, the English Parliament hoped that he would marry a Protestant, probably from Germany. But instead, he married Henrietta Maria of France, daughter of King Henry IV of France, aunt of Louis XIV. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the builder of Versailles. So their children, Charles II and James II, respectively, would be cousins of Louis XIV. Okay. Charles's reign was marred by a long-running dispute with Parliament. The problem with Charles is that he very much took a leaf out of his father's book, believed in the divine right of kings to rule. You've been placed on earth by God, and you are answerable only to God, not to a Parliament. Parliament was beneath you, as indeed were the law courts. The king was above both. This again rankled with the long-standing traditions that were developing in the English Parliament at the time. And in 1628, for instance, Parliament was summoned and they presented the king a petition of rights. They said, going forward, Your Majesty, no taxes can be raised without Parliament's consent. There can be no martial law, no martial law, and there will be no taxes raised without the king's consent. There would be no armies in England except at a time of war, so no peacetime armies, which could be used to suppress the population. It was a bitter debate in Parliament, and actually the king sent word that the vote was not to take place. The Speaker basically told Parliament that the vote can't take place because I have orders from the king that we can't take a vote. And parliamentarians rushed forward and actually held the Speaker in place in his chair and held him in the place because he was chairing. The Speaker is the chairman of Parliament, and they held him in the chair while they took the vote. Charles promptly dissolved Parliament, and he, rather like his father, decided to use whatever wheezes of different levies, historic levies that medieval kings had been able to raise to fund his court. In particular, he raised a thing called ship money. Ship money had been charged in the past, levied in the past, for all the counties with the shoreline of England. Charles said, well, that's very unfair that only places like Devon and Sussex and Norfolk can have to pay for the defence of the realm, because actually the Navy is defending the whole of England. And therefore he levied the ship tax throughout the country. And suddenly people in the shires, in Buckinghamshire, Warwickshire, were paying a ship tax that they'd never paid before. Consternation. And it led to one of the great parliamentarian adversaries to rise up from Buckinghamshire, actually, a man called John Hampden. John Hampden was the leader of the dissident group in Parliament that were opposing Charles. If that wasn't bad enough, things north of the border started to go wrong for Charles as well. Charles tried to introduce into the Church of Scotland basically the Church of England. He wanted a hierarchy, he wanted it streamlined, and he was very keen, rather like his father, to ultimately streamline all the processes into one nation. The Scottish Kirk were having none of it, and when they tried to install some of this, there were riots in Greyfriars Cathedral in Edinburgh, and then the Church of Scotland in 1638, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland came together and signed a solemn covenant, and people across the country signed this covenant to say that the Kirk would be separate from the Church of England and from any sort of hierarchies that the King Charles was trying to put in place. And these people became known as the Covenanters. And what you really started to see, and this is real top-line history here, guys, because I'm covering over 100 years in an hour or an hour and a little bit, but the Covenanters basically said that they could rule Scotland on behalf of Charles. They respected him as the king, but really he had they could get on with it. Charles, of course, based on everything I've just said about how he was trying to deal with the English Parliament, was having none of this back in his historic homeland. And he marched an army to Berwick-on-Tweed, on the border with Scotland, to try and frighten the Scots. It takes a bit more than that to frighten the Scots. The Scots raised a Covenanter army, far bigger than his own army, and appeared at Berwick-on-Tweed on the other side of the river. Charles backed down, but he was seething. And he now called an English Parliament. He called an English Parliament to raise money, to raise a proper army to go up to Scotland and sort out the Covenanters. the English Parliament refused to lend him any money. And interesting as we go forward, the Covenanters and the English Parliament had a close alliance on quite a lot of the time going forward from now. Charles, in absolute frustration, now dissolved Parliament as well. The Scots, Covenanters, invaded England in 1640, actually occupied most of the northeast of England. They occupied Newcastle, and eventually Charles had to sign a treaty, the Treaty of Ripon in North Yorkshire, and it was basically he paid the Scots to go no further. And the Scots said, well, that's fine, but you've got to keep paying us, or pay us a lump sum for us to actually go home. So Charles was now in a real problem. He needed to raise some money to get rid of the Scots, the Covenanters' army in England. So once more, he called a parliament. This parliament, it became known as the Long Parliament. Out of the 493 members, 350 were opposed to the king. That's not a parliament you can work with, is it? And sure enough, there wasn't. Same time, we had major problems. So now people like John Hampden they were in the ascendancy. Those of you who follow British politics, this is like Jeremy Corbyn being in Parliament with 500 out of 600 seats. They were on a real roll here. And there was also a rebellion in Ireland broke out. Now the king was facing rebellion in Ireland that he couldn't put down. He had the Covenanters in the north. He had a parliament in England that was getting very leery, to say the least. And rumours reached him that people in Parliament were going to impeach his wife, the Queen, because they believed she was supporting the Irish rebellion. It was a Catholic rebellion in Ireland. The king was furious, and he came to Parliament to arrest 5 members of Parliament who he believed were leading this impeachment proceedings, including John Hampden and also John Pym. When he arrived, he marched in with soldiers, which had never been done before, and found that the 5 members of Parliament had been tipped off and had escaped across the River Thames in a boat. He sort of sat in the Speaker's chair. He made some polite noises about he had no real problem with Parliament, just some members of Parliament. And then he and his soldiers got up to leave. And as they left, around the chamber in the House of Commons, the words privilege, privilege, privilege were to be uttered and mumbled. And parliamentary privilege now continues to be a sacrosanct part of British parliamentary democracy. By now, the king realised that he had totally lost control in not just Parliament, but in the parliamentary supporting city of London. He fled. He fled north, tried to go to Hull in Yorkshire to seize the arsenal. The mayor of Hull refused to let him into the city. And eventually, he moved south to Nottingham, where at Nottingham Castle, he raised his standard. And by raising his standard, what he really said was, I am now at war. I'm at war with my parliament. And the two sides, through the rest of 1642, that was in August 1642, the two sides now started to manoeuvre and try and gather forces. And the interesting thing here is there was no army in England at this time. Okay, the king had a group of landowners, basically, the gentry, who supported him. They could all ride horses. A lot of them had military experience fighting in Europe somewhere. And because they were all mounted, they took their name from the Chevaliers of France and became known as Cavaliers. And meanwhile, the parliamentarians were grabbing anyone they could. They grabbed the London trained bands, which was almost like a London Home Guard, TA sort of unit. They were reasonably well protected. There were other trained bands elsewhere in the country as well. These were like militias. Most of the militias wouldn't go out of their own county, so a bit of a problem if you wanted to have a war all around England. When the people would say, "Well, we're from Kent. We don't go anywhere except Kent." So both sides were really trying to form armies out of nothing at this stage, and the parliamentarian army, because of the rather severe haircuts that they had, started to be known as Roundheads. Where are we at? The English Civil War. Don't want to go into it. And by the way, it's not an English Civil War. Again, it's one of the terms. Rather like the Stuarts, we forget that the actual war took place elsewhere. what people call the English Civil War was actually 3 civil wars. And it took place at different junctures in England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. Very often others will now call it the War of the Three Kingdoms. And it came and, as I say, ebbed and flowed. And it's not specifically English, not one war. And it went, as I say, across the British Isles. In England, that's the figures we have here, in England, 200,000 people died during the period of the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. Okay, in a 9-year period, 200,000 people died. That's 4.5% of the population. In the First World War, Britain lost 2.2% of its population. So I won't go any further than that, except to say that the Civil War left a massive scar in the psyche across Britain, but in particular in England. 15 to 20% of all adult males carried arms during the Civil War. The first battle was 2 months after Charles raised his standard at Nottingham at Edge Hill, which is just sort of in between Stratford upon Avon and Banbury, and it was inconclusive. The battle didn't really do anything except Parliament weren't able to stop Charles marching on London. So to a certain extent, it was a tactical victory for Charles, but not a decisive one. And 1643, and he marched towards London, went past, marched to the western side of London, had a victory at Tottenham Green. Then at Brentford, he met the trained bands of London all came out, and his army was actually outnumbered by the parliamentarians. So he beat a retreat to Oxford, and there, the winter of 1642, in this day and age, campaigning used to really happen in the summer, and in the winter months, you didn't campaign. So everyone bedded down for the winter of 1642. 1643 was a big year for the for the Royalists, Charles's people. They captured Bristol. Good news in June: John Hampden, his great parliamentarian adversary, was killed at the Battle of Chalcroft Field. And then in December of 1643, the other great parliamentarian, Pym, died of natural causes. But still, the king hadn't been able to land a killer blow, a killer punch on his opponents, and in particular, London remained solidly for Parliament. 1644, the tables started to turn. The Scots Covenanters allied with the English Parliament, and they sent an army down into England. In the meantime, Parliament had finally got their act together, mainly through the Eastern Association under 3 great leaders, Thomas Fairfax, Lord Manchester, and the commander of the cavalry of this new army that was being developed, this new model army, the commander of the cavalry, Oliver Cromwell. They met the king's forces at Marston Moor just outside York, and it was a significant victory. Victory really, it wasn't the new model army's victory. That's how they like to tell it afterwards. The victory would never have come about if it hadn't been for the Scottish Covenanter army that was there at the time. 1645, and slowly the tide of war went against the king. And in June 1645, at the Battle of Naseby in Northamptonshire, Charles was decisively defeated. And this is a photograph. And if you remember, Rob Horn, who's watching this tonight, I know he's here. I mentioned him earlier, said that he'd been on a cruise to the Caribbean. Rob and I, this is a photo we took when we went and visited Naseby battlefield. And this is standing basically where Thomas Fairfax stood as the commander of the parliamentary army. And the king was effectively on that tree line, the skyline over in front of us. I won't go through the Battle of Naseby now, but effect to say that the Royalist cavalry charged, broke through the parliamentarian line, and rather than turning on the parliamentarian army, they kept charging behind the battle, behind where we're standing now, and found the supply wagons, which they then decided to raid or pilfer or pillage or whatever words you want to use for it. And with the cavalry out of the way, Cromwell now swept from the right, sort of sweeping in from where the white flowers are here. He swept in into the Royalist infantry who were advancing up the field towards us. And basically the Royalist infantry were taken apart. Most of them surrendered. And Charles I lost almost all of his infantry at the Battle of Naseby. Soon afterwards, he surrendered. And he surrendered to the Scots, actually, in Newcastle. But they handed him back over to the English. And while he was held in captivity in Hampton Court, while he was in captivity, he had secret negotiations with the Scots, who he now turned, and they now turned against their old English parliamentarian allies. And under the Duke of Hamilton, a Scottish army, not all of it, some of the Covenanters were not keen on what was just about to happen, but a Scottish army under the Duke of Hamilton now invaded England. And this is what was called the Second Civil War. It inspired rebellions. This new invasion on behalf of the king with a Scottish army inspired rebellions in England, in Kent, where else was there? In Cumbria. And there was also a rising, some disaffected parliamentarian soldiers actually defected in Wales as well. Ultimately, Cromwell defeated this invasion at the Battle of Preston in Lancashire. And it was because of this that Charles was put on trial. He was put on trial for treason, for negotiating and encouraging a foreign country. And remember, Scotland was a foreign country at the time. They only shared the same monarch. And the English parliamentarians basically said, you encouraged a foreign country, you, our leader, encouraged a foreign country to invade us. And they put him on trial for treason. And the long and short was that it was a kangaroo court. There was no way that he was going to get off. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. And in 31st of January 1649, Charles I was executed. Have we got a picture of him? That's him on his way to his execution, walking through St James's Park in London. Only king to ever be put on trial for anything, only king to be put on trial for treason, and the only king to ever be executed because of a trial in English history. A Commonwealth was now declared in England. We didn't have a king. Some royalists believed it. King Charles's his eldest son, also called Charles, they proclaimed him Charles II, but he didn't have an army. He didn't really have a country to take over. And so a Commonwealth was, and this was England's sort of, the whole of Britain's, little period of a trial of being a republic. Just point out to my American friends, that's a republic over 100 years before the Americans went that way. And it's an interesting crossover that a lot of the parliamentarians' views on what should have happened in England went across with many dissidents to North American colonies and found its way into the American Constitution. As I say, not everyone in England or not everyone around Britain was happy. In particular, the Scots were not happy that the king had been killed, nor were the Irish. The very brief bit here. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell went to Ireland and put down the rebellion in Ireland, or the king's supporters in Ireland, put it down pretty ruthlessly, both at Drogheda and at Wexford. And then he turned his attention to the rebellion that's being led by David Leslie in Scotland. And he defeated David Leslie's Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar in 1650. Meanwhile, Charles's son, Charles II, had managed to bring an army out of Scotland and come down through England, where he was defeated once more by Oliver Cromwell in 1651 at the Battle of Worcester. And that's where young Charles, had to go on the run and had to hide from Oliver Cromwell's troops up an oak tree. And that gives us the name for, I think it's the third most popular pub name in England, the Royal Oak. That's where it came from. It's a true story. Young Charles managed to get out of England eventually, dressed as a lady, which is quite impressive at 6'3", I think he was. And he was managed to get to France and live in exile. Parliament was now, well, it was supposed to be a parliamentary republic, but Parliament fell out and didn't know what to do. and Oliver Cromwell took over and was proclaimed Lord Protector. And he was to remain almost like a military dictator, really, of England for the next 5 years until he died in 1658. He was succeeded by his son, Richard Cromwell. Great story about Richard Cromwell, but not for now. Richard Cromwell not up for the job, and eventually the parliamentarian army in Scotland, under an Englishman called General Monk, marched on London and basically said, this anarchy's got to stop. There's only one thing we can do. Let's invite back that young Charles. And Charles was brought back as King Charles II. And this is a period in English history, or British history, called the Restoration. And he was Charles II. Again, interestingly, Charles II of England, Charles II of Scotland, two different crowns. And Charles II, the Restoration period, is one of those, it was like a breath of fresh air after Oliver Cromwell's puritanical rule. I've described it in one of my talks. It's almost like it was almost like the Taliban, an English Taliban had been in charge for a while. Christmas was banned, dancing around maypoles was banned. Everyone had to go to church on a Sunday. This is under Oliver Cromwell. And then suddenly we had Charles II rocking up. Fun, rakish theatres became part of, he loved the theatre. In fact, the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, was established under his patronage during his reign. Continues to this day, doesn't it, folks? This was a moment where King Charles, he had to have new crown jewels because Oliver Cromwell had melted down most of the crown jewels during the Republic. And funny enough, the crown jewels, it was the last time someone tried to steal them. Colonel Blood tried to steal the crown jewels from the Tower of London during Charles II's reign. And it sort of says something about Charles, that rather than being infuriated, you can imagine what Oliver Cromwell would have done under the circumstances. Colonel Blood was given a pension and basically by Charles, and used to appear in court all the time, used to hang around with Charles till his dying days. Big thing that Charles is really remembered for when you're talking about gambling, horse racing, theatres, parties, women. Charles actually had 12 illegitimate children from 7 different women. The only child he didn't have was one from his legitimate wife, Catherine of Braganza, Portuguese princess. But apart from the fun and games of his reign, it wasn't all plain sailing. The last great plague, bubonic plague, the plague, came to London in 1665, spread through England into 1666, and of course is the topic of my talk about the village of Eyam in Derbyshire. We also had a war with the Dutch, which went very badly for the English. In fact, it went really badly for the English, to the extent that the Dutch sailed their fleet across the North Sea and sailed it into the River Medway in Kent, which was where the Royal Navy was based. This was England's Pearl Harbor. And they proceeded to sail up the Medway and bombarded the British Navy, the Royal Navy, and captured the flagship called the Royal Charles, just for good measure, and towed it back across the North Sea to the Netherlands. Highly embarrassing for Charles, and say in many respects a bit like a Pearl Harbor moment in the Royal Navy's history. And then we had the Great Fire of London, destroyed most of London, but some things came out of that which are legacies to this day. And of course, the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral by Sir Christopher Wren, and it's still one of the iconic landmarks of London to this day. Christopher Wren also built the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, which became home to a group of veterans supported by Charles, set up by Charles, called the Chelsea Pensioners, set up during Charles's reign. And they exist to this day as well, don't they, folks? As do several other sponsorships of Charles during that time, including the Royal Society, oldest scientific society in the world, and also the Royal Greenwich Observatory. The name says it all, set up by Charles. But his reign and towards the end of his reign were marred by a growing anti-Catholic sentiment in Britain, especially in England. Catholicism, the anti-Catholic bit, had been around ever since the Spanish Armada, and probably before that with Henry VIII, but certainly since the Spanish Armada. And there was this fear that England, along with the Netherlands, were really standing alone against Catholicism and what was seen as Catholic despotic rule, as epitomised by Charles II's cousin, Louis XIV in France. And the English Parliament really, and English Protestants, it was a sense of identity. Being a Protestant equaled English liberty. Being a Catholic equaled despotic, autocratic, divine rule, as epitomised by Louis XIV, the Sun King. And Charles was starting to get brought into this same debate that had haunted his father and his grandfather. He managed to sort of kick it down the road by being sort of nice. But Parliament started to get worried. I told you he had all those illegitimate kids, but no legitimate child. The heir would be his brother, James, Duke of York. James, Duke of York, incidentally, who had led from the front during the Great Fire of London and come out with a lot of accolades. But there was a problem with James. He was an open Roman Catholic, and he was about to come to the throne of England. 3 times, Parliament tried to actually pass a law to stop him becoming king. And 3 times, Charles dissolved Parliament before they could take the vote. And so it was that in February 1685, Charles II died, and his brother, James II, the Catholic, became King of England. It was one of those strange moments in English history. The English are weird. They did this with Mary Tudor. It was a Protestant country. They now have a Catholic king. You'd think they would be really anti and would do anything to get around it. But actually they sort of said, well, yeah, but he is the legitimate heir, isn't he? So whilst we're Protestants, we don't like him being a Roman Catholic. He is our king. Grudgingly, we accept him. And it's not all bad news, because you see, he had 2 children from his wife. She's now dead, actually, Anne Hyde. Anne Hyde, an English woman, married James, and they had 2 daughters, Mary and Anne. And they were both Protestants. So look, yeah, okay, look, we'll suck it and see. James II, it's going to be a bit difficult. He's a Roman Catholic, but, when he goes, the throne is going to go down to one of his 2 Protestant daughters. Happy days again. Not everyone was happy. In fact, actually, one of those illegitimate children of Charles, a man called the Duke of Monmouth, decided that he would actually try and take on Charles and take the throne for himself. He wasn't trying to do Mary and Anne a favour. He felt he'd throw his hat in the ring and see if he could become king himself. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, he landed in the West Country and marched up, gathering a force as he came of local citizens. They were met by government forces coming the other way, and at the Battle of Sedgemoor were totally defeated. Sedgemoor is classified as the last major land battle in England. A few other places would beg to differ, but Sedgemoor is acknowledged really as the last big battle on English soil. And there things may have stayed sort of as they were, until in 1688, his second wife, his new wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son. Mary was a Roman Catholic from Italy, and now the Protestants were looking at a Catholic dynasty, because James, little baby James, it was his name, James Francis, little baby James would inherit the throne over his 2 older sisters, because the throne would go to the boy. And suddenly, those 2 Protestant hopes, Mary and Anne, were out, and it was all about a Catholic. Something needed to give. The good news was that Mary was married to probably the foremost Protestant warrior of his day, William of Orange, the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. It just so happened that William was also in the royal line of succession, because he was Mary's cousin. His mum was Charles and King James's sister. So actually, until little baby James was born, William of Orange was actually 3rd in line to the throne. Now he was 4th in line to the throne. And when some nobles went over, they were called the 7 Immortals, 7 representatives of Parliament and the Royal Navy went over to the Netherlands and asked William and Mary if they would come and save England. William basically said he'd only come and help out if he could be king as well. He wasn't going to play second fiddle to his wife Mary. And actually Mary was quite keen for that to happen. So on the 5th of November, 1688, William of Orange landed with a sizable Dutch force, but also some Scottish and English Protestants, armed Protestants at Brixham in Devon. He marched on London, and unlike a couple of years before, the army that was sent down to meet him, James's army, deserted, came over to him. One of the main leaders of that Royalist army was John Churchill, and we'll talk about him in a moment. James fled London, and Parliament basically said that because he'd fled, he had technically abdicated his throne, and they offered the throne to Mary and William. William and Mary were crowned in April 1689, and they were the only joint monarchs Britain has ever had. William and Mary, and they ruled together. Later in 1689, Parliament passed a Bill of Rights, and it's an important thing. I'll just grab my notes, because it says basically, by law, the monarch could never again raise taxes without Parliament's consent. That's a major break with everything that's happened in the Stuarts up until now. There would be no peacetime army in England, and there would be freedom of speech in Parliament. Never again could parliamentarians be arrested or potentially arrested for what they said in Parliament. And that, ladies and gentlemen, still exists to this day. Parliamentary privilege. You can name people, you can say things in Parliament that will never get you into court for libel or slander, or indeed get you into court because you've slagged off the monarch of the day. That is why it's seen as probably one of the cornerstones of British parliamentary democracy. And that is why this takeover by William and Mary is often referred to as the Glorious Revolution. Or at least it's glorious if you believe in parliamentary democracy. And if you're a Protestant, probably not so glorious if you were James II, who at this time was living in France and had been thrown off his throne by his own daughter and son-in-law, for goodness sake. Not everyone was happy. Up in Scotland, James Graham, Marquess of Montrose, James Graham. Get myself Viscount Dundee, Bonnie Dundee. I knew there was something wrong. I was trying to work out how on earth Bonnie Dundee was from Montrose. Yeah, James Graham, Viscount Dundee, raised a rebellion on behalf of James, or in support of James. He defeated the government forces at the Battle of Killiecrankie, great name, but ultimately came unduck. He was actually killed at the Battle of Killiecrankie. His army continued, but ultimately were defeated at the Battle of Dunkeld. Meanwhile, in Ireland, James had landed with an army, mainly a French army, and started to raise a Catholic army in Ireland to take on, use it as a springboard to come back to mainland Britain. Landed in March 1689, the month before Mary and William were actually crowned monarchs. He landed at Kinsale in the southwest of Ireland and started to march through march through Ireland. It was when he reached the town of Londonderry in the north that the elders of the town weren't quite sure what to do. Should they give in to the king, or should they, as Protestants, try and hold out? And while they were shilly-shallying around, a group of young men called the Apprentice Boys shut the gates in James's face. And of course, the Apprentice Boys are still part of Northern Ireland politics and society and community to this day. The siege of Londonderry was finally lifted by William taking an army of his own men over to Ireland and ultimately defeating James at the Battle of the Boyne. And again, just there we have the Battle of the Boyne is still remembered in Ireland, and the Orange men in Protestant Northern Irish, the Orange men take their name from William of Orange. After the defeat at the Battle of the Boyne, James fled Ireland. Actually, the revolt continued, rebellion continued in Ireland, which is very brave of them, seeing as their leader had left. But he fled to France and died in exile in 1701. And speaking of deaths, Mary actually didn't reign very long. She actually died in 1694, just 5 years after her coronation. She died of smallpox. And William, because they were joint monarchs, William continued to rule in his own right until his death in 1702. And there we have a problem, because where does the throne go? They didn't have any children. Oh, there's Battle of the Boyne. There's them, sorry, getting ahead of myself. The throne was to pass to Anne, which is interesting, of course, because the obvious candidate was still, Catholics would say, was young James Francis Stuart, the little baby. Not such a little baby now. English Parliament said, no, it's going to be Anne. And this had been worked out by William. William realised what the situation was. And one of the things he wanted to do as a legacy was to leave the Protestant state of England intact. Before he died, he got Parliament to pass an Act of Settlement. The Act of Settlement said that the King of England had to be a Protestant. But who? Well, initially, of course, it's going to be Anne. But when she died, and she didn't have any children, by the way, Anne had 17 pregnancies in 16 years. And only one of those children got beyond their second birthday. And even he died, age 12, William, Duke of Gloucester. So by this moment, by the time just before William of Orange here was dying, William III of England, he knew that Anne could succeed him. He also knew Anne had no heir. And quite frankly, based on that track record of 17 pregnancies and all dead, she wasn't going to be producing any heirs. So if you look at that family tree there, the only other living person was her half-brother, James. But he was a Catholic. So where could they go? Well, you had to go upstream. In fact, all the other children of Charles I were either dead or had married into the younger sister had become a Catholic. So we now had to go up to Charles's siblings. Elizabeth was his sibling. Obviously, remember Henry, the elder brother, had died. So the only other one that got to adulthood was Elizabeth. She was the one that had married the German prince. Remember when I was talking about James wanting to go and restore her lands? She'd married the prince of the Elector of the Palatine and the King of Bohemia. She'd had a couple of sons, including Prince Rupert, who was a big leader for the Royalists during the English Civil War. But he was now dead. But she still had a daughter, Sophia. Sophia, by this stage, was in her 70s, so she no longer looked quite like that beauty that we've got on the screen there. But they basically said the Act of Settlement would be that Anne would inherit the throne after William, but when William died, it would go to the Protestant Sophia, who was married to a German prince, the Elector of Hanover. The other legacy, so that's one legacy he left, the Protestant legacy of England. The other legacy he left was that England were in a major war in Europe. It was the War of Spanish Succession. Don't want to go into it too much here. But suffice to say, it pitted Britain and the Dutch, along with some German states, against the Habsburg Empire, Spain, and France. In 1704, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, led the British to one of their most significant victories at the Battle of Blenheim. It's one of those ones that's forgotten in the history books, but actually in numbers and in different nations involved, it equalled the army in size that the Duke of Wellington took into battle at the Battle of Waterloo. He followed up with another 3 victories, and basically the Spanish the Spanish were cleared from their what's called the Spanish Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium, and the French were cleared out of that area. So they were looking to march potentially on Paris. Another thing that happened in 1704, the year of the Battle of Blenheim, was that the British captured a tiny little enclave at the bottom of Spain called Gibraltar. It's still British overseas territory to this day. The other big thing that happened in Anne's reign was the Act of Union between Scotland and England. We said up until now, the monarchs had worn the same, 2 different crowns. They were kings of 2 different countries. They weren't a united country. That was to change with the Act of Union passed in 1707. Passed in 1707, it became the country of Great Britain came into being in 1708, which reunited the 2 countries. into one political system. As I say, Great Britain. So Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, was also the first of the British monarchs. I don't want to go in the act of union. I have to say is one of a fascinating story and one of complete and utter skullduggery, and it was born out of both political imperatives and commercial imperatives. Very top line, political imperative. The Scottish Parliament said, well, it's all very well for the English to have decided on this Act of Settlement under William, but Anne will have the throne and then Sophia can get it. But that's an English thing. We're the Scottish Parliament, and fundamentally, we'll do our own thing. Maybe we'll have a Stuart back, because Stuarts are our royal family. So maybe that James Francis might come back, even though he's a Catholic. But fundamentally, we'll choose our king. And the English Parliament basically were not up for that, because you could end up with another civil war in Britain. So that was a big driver. The English were putting a lot of pressure on the Scots to finally come and say come over and agree to the Act of Settlement. Meanwhile, the Scottish economy went through a really turbulent time in the 1690s, and they weren't bankrupt, but it was certainly a turbulent time, and a lot of Scottish merchants and landowners lost money in a failed colonization in Central America. And they also wanted access to not only the English market, they wanted a single market, funny how the world turns, but also access to all those English colonies that were now being established in North America, because they were English colonies with their own tariffs and not Scottish. Scots had to pay tariffs. So there was some commercial reasons why some Scots might think it was a good idea. Thrown in with a considerable amount of bribery, both financial and lands and titles in England. And eventually the Scottish Parliament voted to accept a union. The vast majority of Scots were against the union. And even 80 years later, of course, Robbie Burns wrote a famous poem about the crooks and knaves that were in the Scottish Parliament who had sold out Scottish independence. And in 1714, Sophia died. 1714, Anne died. And we know where the throne was now going to go, because the Scots were now on board with the English with the Act of Settlement. It was going to go to Sophia. Except 6 weeks before Anne died, Sophia, now in her 80s, 84, finally passed away. Just 6 weeks. I'm talking about great best laid plans go to rack and ruin. However, she had a son, the Elector of Hanover, George. He was a bloke. He was a Protestant, and he was the direct descendant of Sophia. And both England and Scottish, or the British Parliament as it now was, offered the British crown to George I, Elector of Hanover, and George I of Britain, the first of the House of Hanover. The Stuarts' time as rulers of both Scotland and England, and briefly Britain, had finally come to a close. But there was one Stuart who still hadn't given up what he wanted. James Francis. Remember him, baby James? He was still alive and well, and he would still have a say in whether the Stuarts or the Hanoverians would end up on the throne of Britain. But that, as they say, is for another story. So now I'm going to pull back over here